Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing Altered States. This film came out in 1980. It was directed by Ken Russell. Ken Russell has quite a varied career over time. He was considered quite vibrant and flamboyant, but I can't speak to a lot of his film career because I'm not that well versed in his particular canon. But one film, of course, that I have seen of his is the psychedelic cult classic film Altered States. And for those of you who are fans of mine, this is no surprise. It is a very unusual film, and I understand completely why it has developed such a cult following, especially among like the hipsters of the current era who are really into the psychedelics. Because it's not every day that you see a Hollywood movie that is willing to delve into the science and the research behind psychedelics, especially 30 years ago. And I'll be honest, that's how it blipped on my radar. It was in college when I was kind of that that cliche hipster psychedelic person where I had to learn everything I could about them. And naturally, because I'm so into film, I had to look up all the movies that dealt with psychedelics, with DMT, anything like that. And so naturally, this one popped up pretty quickly. And I hadn't seen the film since college, and watching it now, it made me realize a lot about how I viewed it back then. Back then, I was much more innocent. I kind of romanticized the idea of this film a lot because it's like, this weird niche film that somehow got a major Hollywood release. And I'm watching it with these wide eyes like, whoa, it's a movie about DMT, isolation tanks and trippy sequences, all that. But now, as a more experienced individual, I feel quite differently. This is a movie that is, it's a mess. It's a real mess, and it really pissed me off at certain points. And yet there is also something that is kind of unique about it at the same time. And there's something that has a weird comfort to it. It does have that cheesy 1980s aesthetic and the nostalgia going for it. And I've never really been somebody who's drawn to that particular aesthetic, the 1980s aesthetic. But in this film, there was something about it that did have that sort of zeitgeisty, sort of fun experience to it, to an extent. And I do have to give credit where credit is due. I do respect the filmmaker for taking on this particular subject, which of course at the time, and to an extent still now, is considered taboo. It's a very ambitious, very complex thing to tackle, taboo aside, and also working off of something that was written by Paddy Chayefsky, who is, considered an icon, is also no easy task. It is a bold thing to do, but I think that casting William Hurt at the center of the film was really maybe the best choice that they could have possibly had. I really like William Hurt in this film because, he's a very naturalistic actor. And it's not easy, I think, for an actor to be known when he's relying more on subtlety. A lot of the actors who get all the recognition are the ones that are more theatrical, very much actory, they're drawing attention to themselves, a lot of scene chewing. But I'm often drawn to actors like William Hurt because they never overplay anything and everything is very understated. It feels like a real person, which, when you're playing a scientist, I think that really works. Someone who is a realist, somebody who relies on evidence and calculation for their means of control. But he does a really excellent job with the performance, and I think that the arc is very believable as he starts to lose himself, with all of these drugs and getting lost in the scientific research, the obsession. He remains in that invisible technique that I like so much, and he has to do so around some really terrible performances that are really just bad 80s cliches. It's like he's got the bumbling assistant, and then he's got the one person as the big bad establishment who's like, you can't do that, I am in charge. I will not allow for it, I tell you. Just classic bad 80s stereotyping. He's also really good at acting out a trip, like a psychedelic trip. There is a sequence towards the beginning of the film where he goes to Mexico, and he's trying, I'm gonna guess, like ayahuasca, something like that. And it is a ritual. And just his facial expressions and the way he responds to it in terms of his physicality. There's something people miss a lot about what it's like to actually trip, because from the outside it does look quite alarming a lot of the time, especially with really intense doses. So he really captures the ecstasy combined with like a torture, transcendence combined with pain, all of the emotions that are just shooting through to the point where they feel like they're all going to combust. And he seems to capture the essence of all of that in a very real way. And there isn't a moment where I don't buy his arc as a character, as I've said, and I'm not even a fan of the character. I'm not a fan of the writing. I'm definitely not a fan of the character, but I'm a fan of the actor playing the part. This character may be a completely selfish prick, asshole of a man, but that the person playing him is just, a person hired to do what he's told. And even though I really like his performance in the tripping sequences, the actual sequences themselves, the special effects and all that, I am also quite torn on. I think they capture certain things to an extent, but then completely miss the mark in other ways. I like how it brings a lot of elements together at once in a way where it feels like, it's pushing through consciousness in a really intense way, where it feels like a ride or sensory overload, and even like an ayahuasca ceremony or just like a heroic dose of a psychedelic. I like how it feels like a mix of reality and also hallucinations, because in those sorts of situations, it does feel almost like you are in between two dimensions and you're not sure which one is the one you're supposed to return to. A lot of imagery is superimposed over reality, which I like because, yes, especially with like a pure substance like that, you will often feel like that. It feels like one dimension is kind of folded over another, or like, you've got one world folded over another one and you see them both at the same time. But at the same time, these trips do feel a little bit cookie cutter. It's like you've got all kinds of imagery. You've got snakes, you've got people on crosses with goat heads, you've got atomic bomb imagery, but all of it feels a little bit too literal for me, a little bit too cliche. And as it stands, it feels like a summation of what a trip might be, or like an abstract idea of what a trip might be like without fully comprehending it. I think the key to a good trip in terms of just direction is to completely break the rules of internal logic of that film that you're working in. So like if you see a movie like by Gaspar Noé, or if you see a movie by like Tarkovsky even, or like 2001, A Space Odyssey, even Inland Empire, the David Lynch film that I just reviewed. All of those directors in the films that I mentioned, they have, when they're effective in doing something that is kind of trippy, it has a meditative, very soporific quality to it. Spending long stretches in silence so that the edges of the frame sort of melt away and we, our realities and our lives outside of the film kind of disappear and we're fully in the experience, almost like we're one with it. It really allows the edges of the frame to melt away and we lose all concept of time. I, most recently did feel that when I was watching Inland Empire. So it is a really special sort of experience. It feels like a transcendent experience, even though it is a film. And also the imagery in a lot of those films and by those particular directors, they are just not so on the nose as they are in this film. They feel like real experiences and not plot devices. To an extent, though, I do like in Altered States that they show maybe the darker sides of these substances, because I feel like that's something that is neglected nowadays. Because yes, they are incredible and they can bring, so much happiness to you. They can change your life for the better. Absolutely, I do believe that. But if you are not careful, things can go in the other direction just as easily. They can take over your life just like anything that you get obsessed with or that you indulge in too much. If you are an obsessive personality like Edward, the main character, the scientist here, or if you're like me and you're more addicted to emotional extremes. And for me, I've seen both sides of it in my personal life, and I feel like I've come full circle. So that helps you, I think, to have a more well-rounded perspective on it. And I get kind of annoyed, especially now, how a lot of these substances are romanticized to a certain degree, as if they are the cure for depression. And it's like, no, they are not the cure for depression. Sure, they can help, but they are not the answer to your problems. And this film does show what happens when you take things too far and you lose yourself in something like that. And so I do like that from a certain perspective. But at the same time, I also have major negatives to the way that they're presenting, these specific substances, which I guess helps me segue more into a lot of the negative things that I see about this film, because from a moral standpoint, when I look at this movie, I am not on board with it at all. In fact, I felt kind of insulted by it. Everything about this movie, the trips, the research, the conversations about consciousness, the characters, and just the overall point that they're trying to convey about everything in terms of the psychedelic experience and how it's handled, it's all done way too literally. And that, I typically, when I watch a movie, I'll start to, a word will keep popping up into my head about like kind of a summation of how I feel. And that was my word, which is literal. It's literal, literal, literal. I see what they're trying to do. And as I've said, there are certain aspects of that I even admire and kind of enjoy. But I legitimately do want to know what like the pitch meeting was for this movie, like in a big boardroom of people in suits in the late 70s. That would be really interesting. But just ultimately, I don't think that Hollywood is necessarily the best place to be exploring a subject such as this. I think you've got to go outside of that to really push far, where it's not too watered down. And maybe if this were about something different, I could forgive it a little bit more. But because the subject is psychedelics, then it's specifically about scientific research and all of that, I feel like if you're not going to go all the way with it, you're really missing the entire point. You're missing a lot of the potential philosophy that you could gain from it, and just, exploring yourself and gaining true meaning behind it. And because I don't really get any of that, it remains kind of just bound by the screen. It's bound by our literal perceptions of everything, and the result is just kind of flat overall. There's a lot of pseudo-intellectual talk, naturally, because these are scientists and professors at major universities, and they have the flavor of some of the great psychedelic philosophers of all different eras, but just more the flavor and not the actual substance. And overall, I've just seen psychedelia, not necessarily in a literal sense where it's actually about psychedelic substances, but just psychedelic filmmaking of the time. I've seen it handled a lot better than this. This feels kind of like a knockoff of like those Rick Baker films from the 1980s, like the special effects and the makeup. And the body horror, it's all reminiscent, I think, of David Cronenberg. So it feels like a knockoff version of The Fly, or maybe like the poor man's Videodrome. I watched Videodrome recently and reviewed it, so it's still semi-fresh in my mind. And I think what makes that film, or there's so many things that make that film special, but I think one of the things that makes it special is that it approaches things at the beginning more from a literal perspective and a realistic world, and it slowly kind of distorts and disorients the audience and the protagonist. We start to question the medium of film in general, and I think that self-awareness and that ability to take us out and see that perspective in that way is a very powerful thing. And if this film were more like Videodrome, I think it could have been really great. It could have even been a masterpiece, and it needed to question its reality a little bit more. And yes, it can be rooted in reality in the beginning. It can be rooted in the science and the possibilities of all of that. But I think as you start to plunge more into the psychedelic research, where you're actually taking the actual substances, that's where all of your morals are starting to get shaken up and called into question. What does life even mean? And what does my life mean? And the ego death is maybe one of the hardest things for a person to encounter on a trip. But the psychedelic experience is ultimately about the loss of that ego when you are in search of higher knowledge. But with this movie, I felt like I didn't get any of that. It kind of stayed flesh deep, too rooted in human frailty with no transcendence to speak of. And the main character in this movie, really, when you look at it, he learns nothing. Maybe on paper it looks like he learned something, but no, he didn't in the context of psychedelics. He constantly clings to the idea of the material world and trying to make sense of his trips through science. He's always trying to take certain things back with him. He wants evidence. He wants things to be concrete. Anything out there has to make sense in this dimension. And I feel like you can only do that to a certain extent, and the rest of the way you have to just let go and understand and accept that you're just not going to be able to take it all back with you. That's why it's so special. You've got to let go of your personal knowledge, what you know here, the material world, the obsession with finding the answers, because all of that is just rooted in this cocoon, this human frailty, the ego. And I wanted this character to relinquish his ego so bad. I really did. Wouldn't that take the film to an entirely new level? It would be so interesting for this character to have, such an incredible breakthrough and discover the irony behind looking so obsessively for answers, and how perhaps the mysteries of certain things are part of what is beautiful about it. And the character talks about all these crazy doses that he's taking where it's starting to get to dangerous levels, which I highly doubt that. And yet somehow, even through all that, he never quite gets taken out of his reality and never has a full breakthrough on any of it. He never achieves any full kind of fulfillment, and that is just really perplexing. Also very sad. Why make the film then? Why entice us and interest us with certain ideas only to keep them kind of very two-dimensional, like within a picture frame? And the moral of the film, especially in the end, just it really pissed me off. It really, yeah. The risk here in terms of emotional payoff in the script is that Edward, the main character, he has a wife. And, when they meet in the beginning of the movie at this party, they immediately hit it off. She falls for him very quickly, and she wants to marry him. And he's like, I'm not into marriage, I don't do that sort of thing, but, okay, I guess, everything a lady wants to hear. They have kids, and then he wants a divorce because he doesn't really want to be tied down by family. So he wants to be able to go and have that exploration, really delve completely into his work without any baggage behind him. So he leaves her to take care of the kids on her own so he can explore science and fuck university students that are probably half his age. He is only interested in the aspects of psychedelia that he can control, that he can bring back to him so that he has a clear thesis. And you might say, well, yes, this is realistic to what a scientist might be like. Yeah, sure, of course, like that's absolutely true. But to research this particular subject and to be this tone deaf, you know, on all of the overall intentions of it, to me, in the words of Barbara Stanwyck, is like, it's like swimming in an empty swimming pool. But of course he takes it too far, and in his final trip, in the big climax of the movie, he realizes that there is nothing after death, absolutely nothing. And so this means, knowing this information, that he can return home to his wife and children, and it's a happy ending, and fuck that. Maybe if this were a situation where in this trip he went so far that he did have a simulation of death, or like, you know, his brain was sending signals that he was dying, and it helped him to realize the importance of the little things of life on Earth, then yeah, I think it would have worked. Like, you know, an Auntie there's no place like home, Wizard of Oz sort of philosophy. But no, this reduces the possibility of consciousness and death and just the psychedelic experience overall to just a shallow, very rudimentary level that I just find to be really insulting. Or what if he did realize maybe that there is nothing out there? Just theoretically, we'll say he had this revelation on a psychedelic trip, but then how does he handle this? How does he bring that back to life? You know, like, does he unravel, or does he start to recognize that whether or not there is an afterlife or not, the climax of the psychedelic experience and facing the ego is what allows him to see that none of it really matters, that life is maybe not that different from death, vice versa. And now with this nugget, it's time to let it all go. All you've known and everything you've built yourself up to be, that is reaching your true potential. When you achieve true enlightenment, running back to the material world is not the answer, and running back to the life that you once had. It's realizing that you don't need the material world, that you can let go of the idea of the self, of people, of family, just all of those concepts. It can be instilled for real, and then, maybe then, at that point, then he might be allowed to return to his family. That would be a way where it feels actually earned. Or maybe he doesn't return to the family. That could also be an interesting thing to explore. These are just things that I think you need to ponder when you're creating an ending that is worthy of a film title, Altered States. To reduce life and death to something that is so pedestrian just feels counterintuitive as it stands. For the audience here, it feels like they package life and death very neatly in a bow, and it's in front of a Christmas tree so that we can keep it under control. We can keep the concept of life and death in our rear view mirror. No risk, no reward. We don't have any risk, so there is no reward, and neither does the main character. And so in a sense, when you look at it that way, the drug kind of does become the villain. And yeah, I think that that's inaccurate, because the drug is a lot more complex than that, and writing it off as villain is just, you know, shallow. And this film really seems to want to separate reality and the illusion, but I think to really comprehend it, it should be that potentially reality is part of the illusion, which completely changes everything. And then maybe in that way, it causes us to maybe not take things so seriously. The drug itself does not derail Edward's life. He derails his own life. It is all his own making. It is all his own human weakness. And with all of his, you know, intellectual musings and his, you know, like his research and his experiments and his lab, he learns nothing about life. He learns nothing about becoming a better human being. All the substances are reduced down just for the convenience of plotting. And like I said before, I think the real key, like in a Videodrome sort of situation, is to constantly disorient the audience member so that reality and the illusion is always in question. Let the movie go wild and really take us on a ride, you know, like on a journey through this vortex of craziness. Let it distort the way we view things so that we can watch the rest of the film, and even life, we can look at it with new eyes. A good Altered States movie, I think, would make us more okay with walking out of the movie having more questions than we have answers, while also somehow feeling satisfied with the experience and how it ended. Is it achievable? Yeah, I absolutely think it could be. It's just not it's not coming together here. I do think it's interesting to watch, you know, especially from a psychedelic perspective if you're interested in that sort of thing, but I wouldn't recommend it for entertainment or or anything like that. But yeah, that is my review. Thank you guys so much for watching. All of my Patreon supporters are here. You guys are amazing. The link to support that is below. If you are a Patreon member, I am doing a special for commissioned portraits for the holidays, so you can look at that on Patreon as well. And yes, if you're interested, I'm an artist. I can do commissioned portraits, and I have prints available on my website, deepfocuslens.com. The link is below for that. If you have any questions, if you want to work with me, I'm happy to work with you. Just DM me, let me know. But beyond that, all my social media is below. You can watch more videos here, and you could subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.